is one of the series of lectures on social policies in the Arab world. We have started recently looking at the issue of social policies within the program on research and policy making in the Arab world. As we are, what we do is we study different kinds of policy making processes, but we found that social policies are also an area that needs to be addressed. And so we have started doing that through first a series of lectures and as well a series of policy briefs, which will be published on our website very soon. Without further keeping you further, I'm going to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Hassan Hammoud. Dr. Hassan Hammoud is an associate professor of sociology and social work at LAU, the Lebanese American University. Prior to joining the Lebanese American University, he taught social policy and social work at Kuwait University for 16 years. And more recently, he served as a founding director at Qatar Foundation, where he had established a research division at the Doha International Institute for Family Studies and Developments. He has written on several areas of social policy, particularly focusing on social welfare in the Middle East, on the impact of technology on social welfare, and also on the social work on education in developing countries. He has done several consultancies for a number of international organizations and governments such as UNESCO, ESPYs, the World Bank, the Lebanese government, the state of Qatar, and the government of Dubai, producing a number of professional reports. His areas of interest include illiteracy, poverty eradication, health, education, social protection, social security, and other welfare areas, as well as social work and education and other social developments and social policies. We are very honored to have you with us here, Dr. Hammoud, today. Today, Dr. Hammoud will speak about the economic and social reform strategies adopted by Arab states and Arab countries that have resulted in greater inequity in the respective societies. This presentation today analyzes the various external and internal forces that have directly or indirectly shaped social policies in social Arab countries and which have led to the latest popular uprisings, which we have known as Arab Springs. International and regional implications for sustainable development strategies are also outlined, and suggestions of comprehensive national development strategies will be provided in this presentation. Thank you very much, Dr. Hammoud. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, all. Thank you for coming at this time of the day. I know all of you are busy. Thank you for the Institute, Issam Fares Institute, for giving me the chance to discuss with you the importance of social policy. This topic has been and still is long overdue in public hearings and newspapers and even academic writings. So for Issam Fares and the AUB to tackle social policy, it's a long overdue task in the Arab countries, not only in Lebanon. Let me start by addressing the outline of this presentation. It is a bit long. Don't get scared. I will promise you to be brief in summarizing it. It's not a new task that I did recently. Again, I started working on this topic ever since what we call the Arab Spring had started. I will be replacing the word by talking about more properly the Arab uprising. But since this is the title that people are used to equate such movements with, so I'm using it in my title. So without further ado, let me start the outline. This is how I will proceed. I will put the whole thing in a global context before tackling what had happened and why it had happened. Then I will move on to the regional context, tackling some of the challenges in the Arab society in general, and in these countries in particular that had witnessed those movements. I will be talking about the type of economies we have throughout these countries, I will be addressing what the World Bank has called social safety nets. This is to replace what advanced countries used to have in terms of welfare state. So this is a recipe for developing countries that the World Bank had came up with. Then, as a result, I will move to international lessons that I can draw from such experiences, then the regional lessons in brief, and then to conclude and to come up with a recommendation, a list of recommendations or guidelines. So this is the global context. Something that goes unnoticed is the influence of experts going all around the world, advising governments and countries about things to do and things not to do. And this is what is known in the literature, the epistemic communities or international epistemic communities. So I just defined them. These are experts with a set agenda who go around and advise governments. The last 3 decades had witnessed a unique agenda that came up out of what we call the Washington Consensus. And in that agenda, there had been some guidelines about what countries ought to do, countries meaning developing countries or governments, what these governments ought to do and ought not to do. Chief among the agencies responsible for this agenda are, some people had called them the unholy trinity or the bad Samaritans, because their intention is to sell the Washington Consensus to third world countries, under pressure, of course. The World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, and their allies represented in the US and the UK and other advanced countries. Moreover, there had been some bilateral and multilateral agreements that embody such agenda. For example, the Euromed partnership is an example. What is at the basis of this agenda? If you like, in education, we have a term we call the hidden curriculum. What is hidden in this agenda, or sometimes it is declared, the primacy or the priority given to economic forces over political and social forces. And here, what is being sold is one-size-fits-all model to all developing countries. So what is good, for example, for Brazil ought to be good for Lebanon, what is good for Egypt ought to be good for Sri Lanka, etc. And this is a program that we call Structural Adjustment Program. At the basis of such program are economic reforms, financial reforms of both macro level, at both macro level and micro level. And the essence of these reforms is for the government to pull out, or governments of third world countries, to pull out from the economy and from its responsibilities, to reduce its responsibilities toward people, and to deregulate, to lessen the regulations on free trade. And what has been called in this program mainly is privatization. Privatization at the economic level, but also what is of interest to me is privatization at the societal level. That is privatization of social services, i.e. education, social security, health, and social protection. And this is how the World Bank came up with the last one you see in red, a selective approach called safety net approach to help and assist the poorest of the poor. So on one hand, reducing the role of governments in the life of people and in the economy, and on the other, just attend for the poorest of the poor in a very selective way. Allow me to quote two experts, two world-known experts. Joseph Stiglitz is a Nobel Prize laureate and former consultant and advisor to the World Bank and former advisor to President Clinton, addressing this structural adjustment program and this hidden curriculum of one size fits all by saying that the international community had imposed this market liberalization which had led to the 2008 crisis and it spread around the world. Another quotation by the same author is saying that the US and other advanced industrial countries had foisted on developing countries liberalization policies without any appropriate safeguards. In another book on social inequality, The Price of Inequality, he said, more than anything else, a sense that economic and political systems were unfair is what motivates the protests around the world. In Tunisia and Egypt and other parts of the Middle East, it wasn't merely that jobs were hard to come by, but that those jobs that were available went to those with connections. That shows how bad is this hidden agenda for developing countries, and that it is not serving the real interest and needs of the people. Another Nobel laureate, Amartya Sen, famous developmentalist, he had worked on development in third world countries. He said, development requires the removal of major sources of unfreedom, poverty as well as tyranny, poor economic opportunities, as well as systematic social deprivation, neglect of public facilities, as well as intolerance or overactivity of repressive states. However, with this situation, one cannot overlook the changes that had taken place over the last 3 decades, despite this recipe. So what are the changes that had happened during those 3 decades? The first one is that the invisible hand that all of us had heard about is not working. So markets are, the assumption is that markets are efficient if government is kept out of the way. Another result of this invisible hand, that the trickle-down effect had been proven to be a recipe for failure in most developing countries. And the irony is that some of this work is done by these authorities, by these organizations, even the World Bank. Economic growth, although necessary, is insufficient to alleviate and reduce poverty and inequality. And rejection of the one-size-fits-all model, the World Bank came up with another recipe, 8-size-fits-all model. But we are not seeing any of this being implemented in our part of the world. And failure of the neoliberal model to hand over the role of the state to market forces. Other changes, the importance of social policies which ought to be at the interface of all public policies. And the technocratic approach to organize such social policies alone is not enough. Even the safety net approach that the World Bank came up with and trying to spread it all around the world, the ILO came up with an opposite strategy. It's called the social protection floor, just during the last couple of years. And there had been a change from a selectivist approach, which is represented in the safety net, to a universalist and inclusive, more inclusive approach. And another change, which is beyond the Band-Aid or one-shot cure-all approach to address development challenges in a more comprehensive way. The same Amartya Sen had, in the year 2000, addressed the issue of developments and talked about 5 instrumental freedoms. First one, political and civil entitlements or freedoms. The second one, economic entitlements in terms of jobs, job opportunities. The third one, social opportunities in terms of health services and education and social protection. Transparency guarantees at the level of government is another instrumental freedom. And last but not least, protective security, that is the need of people to have retirement compensation and social security. Now let's move to the local level. With that in mind, what are the major challenges that the Arab countries had gone through and are still going through in the recent time, in the last 3 or 4 decades? We've been moving toward a free market economy. Whether successful or unsuccessful, I'm not discussing this issue in this context. There is not a clear social and political contract between people and the governments. National development programs are weak, on one hand. On the other hand, we've been witnessing rapid population growth. In some countries, their populations are even doubling every 20 years, like the case of Syria, for example. Another characteristic or challenge is the youth bulge, or the growth in the percentage of population under 24 years of age. So the youth bulge, it makes like 2/3 of the population in the Arab world, which are under 24 years of age. And concomitant to all this, widespread corruption and no accountability whatsoever. In addition to crony capitalism, the alliance between governments and businessmen, lack of long-term inclusive vision on the part of decision makers and politicians and regimes, failure to generate decent and productive jobs, sluggish economic growth, the exchange of limited economic entitlements for political ones, like in the case of employment, public sector employment, or subsidies even, great socioeconomic disparities in the region, and the systematic exclusion and marginalization of the most deprived people. All this would lead, or had led, to rampant poverty all around the Arab world, with the exception of all rich countries, and lack of respects of human rights and suppression. So with that in mind, with this background, let's see the impact. Another added component to such challenges is that even if the economies were working, yet they were not producing enough jobs. And this is what we call jobless economies. In this context, for example, the World Bank, the advanced countries, were celebrating that Tunisia is the best model to tell the world how open market economy is working. But they were shocked, not surprised, by the uprising. That proves my point, that on one hand, growth was, economic growth was rising, yet people's needs were not met. In 7 out of 10 countries, inappropriate educated labor force. Hammoud Bouazizi is one of such examples. Low female labor force participation. We have in the Arab world the lowest female participation in the world. Yet, we cannot find an explanation that female population, female students at universities, they outnumber male students. Limited labor market demands for educated workers. Hammoud Bouazizi, probably, he was qualified, but there was no demand for such skills that he might have had. Unfavorable macroeconomic conditions, inhibiting investment in productive sectors. It's not only our people who are flooding the countries or migrating, but even businesses and investment. And for that, the Arab countries are facing a great challenge to find 92 million jobs by the year 2030. So this is the international background, the global background, and the regional background. But what compounds all this is, allow me to move a bit to a theoretical framework that may expand our understanding of the situation and prepare us for the Arab uprisings, to understand best or better what had happened. This is my framework that I supplement the global context with. I call it the 3 I's plus 1. By the 3 I's, meaning ideology, ignorance, and inertia. This is in a recent book, came up in a recent book on poor economics. Ideology is the neoliberal ideology, for example, or it might be the ideology of the people, the ideology of decision makers. One recent example 2 weeks ago or 10 days ago was represented in one Egyptian minister coming on a TV interview. I don't know if any one of you had seen it. And in answering a question, what do you think, who might be eligible to be a judge? Would you think that the son of a garbage collector might be eligible if he goes to universities and earn his degrees, might be eligible to be a judge? Of course, he had to resign his post because his answer was not. This is what I mean by ideology on the part of decision makers. And ignorance, another issue, not that they don't have the information, but they misuse or intentionally overlook such information. And inertia, they are not ready to do anything. This is paralysis. But what I'm afraid of is that these 3 I's might impact even the people. The passivity and the apathy on behalf of the people might be impacted by these 3 I's. The second section of this framework is institution. The failure of institutions at the macro level and institutions at the macro level. 3 minutes left. One could spend more than 1 hour talking about this framework alone, but I will leave the floor to you to raise questions later on in our discussion. So this is the safety net program that the World Bank is advertising and trying to enforce throughout the Arab world. It proved that it is inefficient and ineffective in reaching the bulk of the poor. I give you some time to look at the characteristics of such safety net. Only a minority benefit. The majority are from the middle class. Here we are talking about, for example, subsidies. Fuel subsidies in Egypt, 60% of the people, if not more, benefit from fuel subsidy. So they are inefficient. They do not address poverty and inequality. In addition to all this, we find deficiency in the social protection system, in social security and pension and retirement. In addition to deficiencies in education, ironically, the illiteracy rate in the Arab world is still on the average 23%, but some countries have 30 and above, 30% of their population illiterate. So here we have other deficiencies also in the education and in health provisions in terms of preventive health, for example, or quality of health services. All this had led to what we call the spark of the Arab uprising. Hammoud al-Baradei, former director of the International Atomic Energy, when addressing the uprising, had said repression plus absence of social justice and denial of channels for peaceful change had led to a ticking bomb. And these are the slogans that came up in the Tahrir Square. Freedom and dignity, karama, hurriya. They have used literally bread. In Egyptian slang, bread is aish. I broadened it to use the word livelihood. Badna naish. It is not badna naish only. They were literally thinking about the loaf of bread that is earning a living. So I broadened it for decent livelihood. Social justice is another slogan, and human rights. And these literally, you can see them on Tahrir Square, these slogans. I'm not going to go into the international lessons and regional lessons, the importance. They all show the importance of social policy to be properly addressed and considered at equal footing as economic policies. In conclusion, the neoliberal model has failed either to generate economic growth and dynamism. Social policies are at the center of development strategies. Social policy is more than a limited set of safety nets. And this is an expert at the UN headquarters who had said that as early as 2007, and service to cover market failure. The same expert had said ineffective social policies could lead to the spark of state breakdown. So I'll stop here. I have some recommendations for later on in our discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Hammoud. I think your presentation identified very well the global and regional trends, underlining some of the challenges that are being faced, particularly in countries of the region, and highlighting some of the limitations or initiatives actually put forth by and promoted by international organizations, and briefly highlighting these limitations to these. I would like to open the floor for questions and answers. We'll take a few questions and then give the chance to Dr. Hammoud to answer. We'll take a question from here. Yes, please introduce yourself briefly as you ask your question.
Well, my name is Adel Cortas, a former Minister of Agriculture in Lebanon. I like very much the presentation made by Dr. Hammoud, and it is appropriate and right to the point now. However, I agree with you that we are all for social policies to be implemented within the Arab uprising, you know. But can we afford it? We have to give first priority to economic development first in order to be able to reach the level of social policies and to distribute the wealth of the nation to the people. Therefore, as an economist, I have to give priorities, and my priority is for economic growth. Second, I have to put more emphasis on education. Unfortunately, in the Arab world, education is not appropriate, it's not right to the point, it's not geared to eliminate unemployment. I am sorry to say that we have more unemployed educated people than we have non-educated people. And then I have to give first priority also to women in development. Women in development. Half of the population are women, are female. And then we have to give them more opportunities to enter the realm of working within the nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take a colleague from here, and then we'll take a question from.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Hammoud. Most of what you said was music to my ears. But one minor, very minor correction, perhaps. Stiglitz was chief economist at the World Bank, and he resigned his post towards the end of the 90s. And I think, all in all, I think you've been too kind to the major players, whether international or national. For instance, you referred to ill-fated projects, and I would say ill-designed and ill-implemented. Point, blank. In a more positive sense, I would rather say that no amount of economic growth within the context of the rentier mentality that we have, the rentier practices that we have, will produce any good for anyone, even for the regimes that are at the helm of these rentier economies. So let's be clear about that. What needs to be done is change this rentier setup that we all have. And I would support the colleague here in emphasizing the importance of education. And I would also emphasize the role of modern technologies, new technologies in disseminating education. And I think there is a great deal of scope here for educating the masses, particularly for community development, for development at the community level, rather than overall. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll take one more question from the lady.
Hello. I want to ask on the country level of Lebanon. I know we have the National Poverty Targeting Program, targeting the poorest class. And it's been going on since 2006, not very successful. If you were to think of to redesign the program or to design a social protection program, how would you move away from this selectivist, residualist approach to make it more inclusive for Lebanon?
Thank you. Dr. Hammoud.
Thank you. I cannot but agree with your suggestions about the emphasis on education, which I did allude to, but for the time frame, I was not able to tackle the issue of education. I alluded to women's in development, the importance. Recently in 2011, did a study on female graduate in Lebanon, for example. 50% of the respondents who were working said they are not planning to keep on working after they get married. So it's a matter also of aspirations and goals at the individual level, not at the macro level only. In terms of resources, well, again, here, how can we balance between the social needs and the economic needs? Most recently, Brazil has succeeded in bridging this gap and balancing the two. Now, Brazil is part of the BRICS, as we know, in terms of economic growth. They succeeded somehow, better than before, but they had addressed the basic needs of the people through their family policies, for example, in terms of providing social protection. Even the World Bank, not all its policies and dictates are bad. There are some cash transfer to the poor that could, mitigate the influence of poverty on their lives. In terms of the rentier state, well, when I talked about institutions here, if we address the issue in the Arab countries, we can talk about extractive institutions, pulling everything from the people, not giving anything in return. I'm not here addressing the issue of the oil-rich Arab countries. Well, probably because of their wealth. I have addressed that issue as early as 1986 when I was in Kuwait and wrote about the welfare state. They are co-opting their people with their own money, the people's money. So keep quiet when it comes to political freedoms. Take whatever you need in terms of services, money. You are living in a wealthy society. And it worked. This is why their populations kept silent. During the Arab Spring, nothing had happened. So it is working. For the rulers, of course. As for Lebanon, I'm moving to the issue of Lebanon. Yes, I know, I'm aware of it. And I'm critical about what has happened. And unfortunately, we started it in 2006, but we are in 2015. Nothing had happened. Targeting is not a cure. They registered the poor, 300 or 30,000 families had registered. They are not representative of the 300,000. The other day, in the newspaper, a report, I think from the Ministry of Social Affairs came up. 1 million Lebanese live under poverty level. So from the million to give services or conditional cash transfer to 30,000, this supports my point, that it is a Panadol for a more serious disease, that is cancer.
Any more questions? Yes, we have one. Okay, we'll start with the, hello? Yes, please. Then we'll go down.
Thank you, Dr. Hammoud. Roland Riesche, postdoctoral fellow here at IFI. In fact, my question is, we often list the pressures or the tools that neoliberal, like the privatization, the structural adjustment that can be listed into privatization, cutting budget. But what are the pressures that are in counterpart? What does the country have to do to be able to? We can maybe just to have another list also of those, and what is the counterpart of this structural adjustment policies, and
For not doing?
for doing.
For doing.
Yeah, if you do structural adjustment, what is your
Get out of it.
Yeah. Because we talk about pressure, so what do you get out of it?
Definitely.
Yeah. And my second question is, now we're talking mainly about the new generation or the second generation of structural adjustment. I don't know if you would like to also develop on this point. Thank you.
Thank you. We have one more question from the lady.
Can we look at the recommendations? Can you please inform us about the recommendations you have made to solve these problems and to address them?
Thank you. Any more questions? All right.
Thank you for the questions. For Mr. Riyashi, as you know, there are conditionalities. There are sanctions on countries. You do this or else. The ranking of countries is one of them internationally. So, for example, getting you from B plus to B minus or to B, or from B minus to C. Direct and indirect sanctions. And by the way, our situation, we are among the developing countries in terms of structural adjustment. We are laggards behind, probably thanks to our, fragile situation. We were not able to do anything or to respond to such conditionalities. But we are now going through it. And the turmoil and the demonstrations you have in terms of the employees demonstrating for the fourth year, Silsilat al-Ritab wal-Rawatib, is the best example. There this is the stick. You cannot raise salaries from our money. You borrow money and you need to spend it or waste it on people? No way. Come up with alternatives and fine with you. See the conditionalities, the carrot and the stick. As to the I'm aware, of course, the post-Washington, things are developing. There's no stalemate. I mean, it's not a fixed package. It keeps on changing. But unfortunately, I have my theory about change, social change in this part of the world. We haven't yet gotten to the 20th century. Here you are telling me about the 21st century, the post-Washington consensus. We haven't met the requirements of the Washington consensus to deal with the requirement of post-Washington consensus. Neither our politicians nor our people are in this mood or are ready for that. As to my recommendations, well, in order not to go back to the PowerPoint presentation, I can sum them up in order at 3 levels. The political level, we need more inclusive and participatory regimes. And the Arab Spring or the Arab uprisings, they proved or they provided us with the momentum to change. And you have the case of Tunisia. Change is not direct. It takes time. Look at Tunisia. To come up with their constitution, they took a couple of years. To implement it, this is another thing. So the first level is political reform. The second level is economic reform. Of course, it is how to make these economies work and provide productive jobs. Of course, while addressing the demand and supply. The quality of education, for example, is something to be desired. It is not how much we were able or we succeeded in providing seats for our children. So, for example, the literacy rate, if you only take attendance in the Arab world is 90, 95%, 98% in the Gulf countries. But this does not provide me with the right supply to the job market. I need to address the quality of education in order to balance the supply and demand. And last, the importance of social policy. Not to have economic policy at the expense of social policies. That is to address the challenge of poverty eradication, for example, or poverty reduction. And here we have another agenda, by the way, the MDG, the Millennium Development Goal. This is another international agenda that Lebanon had failed in meeting, for example. We had 15 years, all developing countries had 15 years to meet the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, among which is to eradicate poverty or cut poverty in half. Very few Arab countries had done so. 3 Arab countries, I think. And now this is the post-MDG. This is like the Washington Consensus and the post-MDG.
Yes, the last word for
I have a theory, and please check me on this, if it is right or not, that all nations, they have to pass through this uprising movement. Look at even Switzerland, they have had their guerre de religion wars in Europe. They have had their revolutions. In the UK, they have had the Cromwell revolution, even the United States of America. Now, we need to pass through this uprising, even in Lebanon, since 1843, 45, 1860, and the last civil war we have had in Lebanon, in order to achieve or to attain a certain level of stability and equilibrium.
So
what do you think about it?
We need instability in order to have stability.
Exactly.
I agree.
Listen, I have noticed that all over all my studies, and if you go to the history of all nations, it is the case.
Well, things are not as clear, you know. It takes 2 people to tango. That is, it is not internal conditions which are at stake. The external conditions are also at play. Here I am remembered of a famous book in terms of what is happening in terms of the external factors or forces impacting change, economic change, political change in developing countries. It is, it's not conspiracy theory, it is like descent to chaos. But this is the result of another mindset or another discourse that came up from the famous Chicago school, the Friedmanite Milton Friedman. That is what they have done from the 70s in Chile till China nowadays and Russia. They are spreading their agenda of getting countries to a crisis situation in order to get their policies. And so this is what you are making me think of.
I would very respectfully disagree that history has to repeat itself in various parts of the world in order that we can jump over the hurdles. What we have to remember, I feel, that the forces that now hinder true development and poverty eradication are global rather than regional or national. And that there is again, I'm not preaching any conspiracy theories here, that there is some kind of liaison, that there is some kind of give and take between the regional, the national, and the global. So history does not repeat itself in various places. It does not have to anyway. Thank you.
I'm just going to take one last comment from our colleague Roland before we close.
I'm gonna continue on what my colleagues were saying. This scales of globalization and let's say it the capital crisis or the capital accumulation wise. So if we get back just to the stick and the carrot we're talking about, well, actually what is in front of us is the loans or whatever money can be given. So if we take structural adjustment as having a cyclical effect, so you cut your budget, you won't have any more public utilities, you privatize through, you are doomed by loans, public debt, which is public debt. So it's a cyclical effect for capital accumulation. So should we, by the end of the day, think of refusing international development loans? Is it this, can we start it this way maybe, to break this cycle?
Again, it is not a zero-sum game. That is, take it or leave it. We can always use international loans and international aid, but in our way. The way it suits us, not necessarily the way it suits other people and international organizations.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hammoud, for a very interesting topic. And please do look forward to the published brief on our website very soon. Thank you very much.